Hi, this is Tejas Puranik. I am a Senior Director of Solutions Engineering and Compliance here at Intellect.
Hi, I'm Steve Gompertz. I'm a principal partner with QRX Partners, where I provide consulting to the medtech industry on quality and regulatory issues based on my 30 plus years of experience in the medtech industry.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve, for joining us here. So today we will get some experts' advice on how process mapping is key in defining quality of products and services in the world of regulated industries. So, Steve, working with clients here at Intellect, we often hear that companies still operate in silos despite of ISO 13485's emphasis on a process-based approach. Now, from your perspective, why do you think organizations really struggle to move away from the traditional functional structures?
Part of it is that old habits die hard. We started with, the original quality standards, the ISO 9000 series was based on a very functional view of quality, right? Here's a list of activities. It lent itself well to doing like a checklist approach. All right, I need to have doc control. I need to have supplier control, right? All these activities, right? And if I check them all off, the belief was now quality occurs. And the whole point of going to the process approach in the year 2000, when they rewrote ISO 9001, and that's what 1345 followed, was that, that checklist approach does not get you quality. You have to see it as a system. That's why it's called a quality system. And in order to do that, you have to understand all the connections, all the interrelationships. And that's what the sections of the standards that talk about process-based approach talk about, understanding not just what the activities are, but how they interconnect. That's hard. It's hard to see your entire quality system. That takes work and time, and you have to rethink things, especially if you already have it set up. And people tended to, number their SOPs and their sections of their quality manual to reflect the standards, right, that they were applying. And now you've changed all that. And now there's different numbering in different sections, and it's ordered in a different way. And then there's the challenge of if you have to comply with both 9001 and 1345, they've diverged a little bit, where 9001 is following the new structure for management systems under ISO. 1345 is still following the old format. So they don't call things exactly the same way. So there are a number of things that get in the way. And the simple answer is because the work got harder in order to have a more effective quality system. But that's the way you get effectiveness out of your system.
That's very great to hear, Steve. So, tell us a little bit more, since you're working with clients here in the regulated space, talking about the processes itself and process mapping. What tools or mapping methods do you think would actually resonate really well within the teams in the regulated companies?
So it's good that you said tools, plural, because too often we try to apply a single tool in these situations. And I think we all know that old saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every job starts to look like a nail. As a good quality professional, you should have a toolbox, right, with lots of tools in them that you understand how to use correctly and when to use them,
Right.
because it takes more than one. I think a good starting point is a SIPOC diagram, right? Suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and customers. It's a great way to communicate, because if you walk into a department or, whatever level you're going to start with, hopefully you do a top-down approach, and you start saying, tell me about your process and how it connects to others. And, some people understand it, some people won't get the question. SIPOC gives it a more structured approach, right? We go, well, let's talk about this particular activity. How do you get, what inputs do you need to even do the work, right? And then, usually people can talk about that. And then you say, where do you get them from? And that may be a more complex question to them, right? Because maybe there's multiple sources. Maybe they haven't thought about all of the possible sources. And then you talk about outputs, and they know what they produce at the end of the day, what artifacts. And then you say, where do those go? And then that one usually twists them. They kind of go, oh, I haven't really had to think about that. I think somebody here in this department uses it. But that's what gives it context, right? How do you know you're producing the correct, or adequate artifacts if you don't know who the customer is? And that's the whole point,
Right.
of understanding your internal customers. I like to actually use a modified version of SIPOC. I add some arrows above and below it. The arrows above represent what I would refer to as technical supporting processes. So things like document control, maybe legal, right? Where you identify what are the other processes that support our ability to do this activity. And then underneath, the arrows coming from the bottom are kind of the people supporting processes. So is it training management, document controls, things like that that enable people to be competent within that process. I think that gets you a nice clear picture of what's going on. Once you have that kind of understanding of a particular activity, it gets easier then to understand, right? Because now you know who stuff came from and where the outputs go to. The connections start to become clearer. Okay, we have an automatic connection to those places. And when you have those other technical supporting and people supporting processes, you have more connections that you've just identified, right? And so the light bulb starts to go on. Then you can get into things like just basic flow charting. Again, assuming you know the correct way to use flow charting, because it is a formal tool, and people forget that there are several different types of symbols to use in a flow
Right.
chart that convey more intelligence about the flow chart. Don't just make everything a rectangle. There's more to it than that. But now you start to create those connections and graphically, right? So people can visualize the mapping of all of this. I also like a form of flowcharting called IDEF0 that came out of the Department of Defense, which adds a little bit more intelligence to a flowchart in that where the arrows connect to the box tells something about the role of what you're describing. And that the four categories are, if it comes in from the left, it's an input. If it goes out to the right, it's an output. That's the usual stuff. But if it comes in from the bottom, those are mechanisms. And if it comes in from the top, that's a control. And now you've got these four categories to think about. Oh, what's the nature of the connection between these boxes? Not just the fact that they are connected in a certain sequence. And so the example I can give is if your department's job is to produce a tool, right, to use in manufacturing, that isn't an input to the manufacturing process. It's a mechanism for them.
Right.
And if your job is to write the manufacturing instructions, your output is the work instruction. That is, again, not an input to the manufacturing process. It's a control on that process. So understanding the nature of those connections, I think, adds even more to understanding, is my quality system really connected correctly, rather than just, oh, here's the order in which things happen, and that's what the arrows represent. And the assumption that every arrow is an output to an input, which is not necessarily the case. So building more intelligence, again, helps you apply that process thinking and better understand your quality system.
Great insights, Steve. Very fantastic insights. And whoever's listening right now from the regulated industry, absolutely great insights. Use SIPOC analysis to begin with, but as you go deeper, take a look at the flow charts. Use the intelligent flow charts to start mapping out your processes. Thank you, Steve, for sharing that. Now, speaking of those tools, and you did mention about companies starting to put together those different processes and documentation. We also have seen some companies just tend to build a QMS that ends up being a dense collection of SOPs. Like too many SOPs goes into the QMS.
Yeah, I call that a pile of SOPs.
Pile of SOPs. There you go. Exactly. So, from your experience, Steve, what guidance do you give to such companies, organizations out there to design a system that's going to be lean, scalable, and really process driven?
Yeah, I think like anything else, you have to help them recognize why their current approach is a weaker approach and not producing the results. And sometimes I'll put it in terms of you bringing in a new employee and you need to explain to them where they fit and how they do their job, right? And typically they have a training plan, and again, that list of SOPs that apply to them, which is probably much longer than they actually need it to be. And they go, they have to train to these. And I go, great. Which one first? And they kind of go, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Which one comes first? Right. And because they haven't mapped out the processes, they struggle to answer that. Or sometimes I'll get multiple answers in the same room and everybody will look at each other going, wait, that's not right. Yes, it is. And then there's an argument. I go, see, you don't even understand how your quality system works. And how are you going to explain that to an employee? And how are you explaining it to your current employees? I'm going to bet they probably learned from somebody else through tribal knowledge, which you don't know is accurate because you have nothing to compare it to. So usually the light bulb starts to go on there and they go, okay, you're right. We don't seem to actually understand our quality system. And then you can look at things like, some of these processes that clearly have to be integrated, right? And I'll look at something like management review, right? And I'll look at what are the feeders to that? What are you talking about at management review? And there's always some elements missing or something they're not measuring. And it's like,
right.
Oh, I didn't know we were supposed to. Yes, if you had mapped this out, you'd understand that there's a connection from these things into management review, and from management review into planning, and from planning into preventive action. These are all supposed to be integrated. They're not standalone processes. If you treat them standalone, it gets harder to pull the information you need to truly understand what's going on. And usually, so it's an education, right? They've got to start to understand the concepts, not just throw this idea. You're supposed to be doing a process approach. Well, what's that mean? Let's illustrate that for you. And then by the time you show them an example of one, the light bulb goes on pretty quickly. I always talk about the first time you try to map out something in your quality system, it takes like hours. The second one takes like 30 minutes. And then from there, it just starts clicking along, right? Because
Right.
now they've got it. They understand what you're trying to put together. So it sounds like a daunting task. And when you start, it just seems really burdensome, but it picks up speed really quickly as you start. And you see people start to get excited about how I really understand. I actually hadn't thought about this. And it helps you see, are there disconnects in our system? I remember we did an exercise with one company. A guy was putting all of this into a relational database after they had spent millions with a consultant to redo their product development process. And those consultants did the thing with identifying all the inputs and the outputs and where they go. And he decided to put them into a database, and he found out there were all these places where outputs went nowhere. Inputs didn't have a source. So in other words, how are they going to get them done? There were redundant outputs, redundant inputs. And suddenly you're going, no wonder this is so, inefficient, right? You want to talk about being lean. If you can't see everything, then how are you going to decide, how are you going to make things leaner? And so suddenly this effort up front that seems really burdensome produces incredible benefits downstream, right? And for the long term.
Fantastic. My takeaway from this, Steve, is don't have millions on piles of SOPs out there, but have them integrated. So that's how you start building up towards, being lean, being scalable, and really process.
Yeah, and you get to see, when you do that, you also get to see where there's opportunities maybe to eliminate certain procedures and work instructions, right? Because a lot of times that's our response. We have a CAPA and we've got to document something more detailed, right? So we add more detail to a document. We add yet another work instruction, and the pile just keeps growing bigger.
Right.
And it's because you don't understand the connection. So the only thing you do is apply a Band-Aid, right? And you keep adding more and more Band-Aids until you're covered in them. When maybe it was the idea of going, you know what? Why do we have 3 procedures that sound like they address kind of the same thing or certain similar elements of the same process? Couldn't they just be in that process, right? They just have activities within that. We don't need a separate document, which now we have to maintain training records on. We have to maintain change control records on them, right? Where we could have had fewer documents that were actually more correct.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's what companies should be aware of. Like, fewer documents, which are going to be more effective than having thousands of documents out there. And then investing your resources in managing them, approving them, getting people trained on it. It's very inefficient. Great insights.
It seems counterintuitive, right? Because again, we're used to this idea of I have a CAPA, I have to address it somewhere and I have to add detail. And I do some workshops on ways to be more effective in your quality system. And one of the things I talk about is leaning out your documentation, and that actually less detail actually creates a more effective procedure. And that just seems really counterintuitive. And people just kind of go, I don't get it. How is that going to work? And I just look at it like the longer you make your procedure or your work instruction, the more opportunities you're creating for people to not comply with it or to forget it or not get what's really important within it, right? Because now you've just dumped a whole bunch of details on them and they don't know which are the really critical steps anymore. It's impossible for them to keep it in their heads. Nobody likes to go back and reread the work instruction. They want to get trained and then they just do it from memory, and you've just given them more stuff to forget.
Very true. Yeah, very true. Great insights, great suggestions here for sure. Now, Steve, looking ahead, right, let's talk a little bit about the emerging trends, the technologies that's coming up, AI, machine learning, right? How do you see process mapping and digital tools like QMS software evolving to support these emerging technologies, AI, machine learning, software as a medical device, if you will? And then sometimes companies out there just want like remote audits. How do you see this technology is going to be adopted by the QMS tools with the process mapping in there?
Yeah, I think there's great opportunity for the eQMS vendors, and I don't want to cast aspersions on any particularly you guys, but the industry right now supports that more functional view. When you buy an eQMS, it has all these different modules which kind of align with the individual functions, and then you decide which modules you're going to use, and it's up to you to configure it right? And then there may be some integration between the modules that the vendor provides, but you're expected to have done your mapping separately, right? I
Right.
think the real opportunity, whoever wants to get there first, is to leverage AI. And when somebody starts up for the first time, they fire up Intellect, let's say, it gets into a conversation or it provides a mapping tool. And it says, all right, let's talk about at a high level what your quality system looks like. What are your major
Right.
process categories, right? Let's take the blocks, either from 9001 or 1345 and go, all right, let's talk about leadership, which is 9001, or management responsibility, which is in 1345. What major processes go in there, right? And start taking somebody through that conversation and build the process map for them. And then when it's done, you go, okay, hang on, we're going to go configure the system to match that. That to me would be pretty amazing, right? I think that
Wow.
would
Yeah.
turn the industry on its head and just change things. So I'd love to see that. I have not seen anybody. There's a lot of the eQMS vendors are starting to add AI, but it's usually like, help me find stuff in the system, right? So that I don't forget. And that's important, right? To be able to go, all right, we're thinking about doing this in terms of our next design verification strategy for this product. We want to make sure we're consistent with what we've done with similar products, and an AI is great at pulling that information. I talked to a lot of people who said when they turn on their own closed loop AIs and ask it to kind of assess their documentation, the number of disconnects or inconsistencies it finds is important. But again, you're still going to then try to use the existing functionally based quality system that you've established and wonder
Right.
why it isn't being as efficient and effective as you'd like to be. I think if the tools could help you build that map, it would take away that burden we talked about earlier about I have to do all these SIPOC diagrams and I have to people have to understand it. And then we have to do flow charts and maybe we're going to add IDEF 0 terminology to it. If somebody's eQMS just guided you through that process, started a conversation with you and then mapped it out and says, does that look correct? Like what we talked about? Great, boom. Here's your system configuration. Everything's connected. I think
Well,
the
speak
power of
about the
AI.
efficiency, right?
Oh, sorry, what was that?
No, I was saying speak about the efficiency gains there, right? For sure, leveraging AI will definitely help boost establishing the processes sooner, making things much more easy for the people. Like in your example, SIPOC analysis, flow charts. Have AI help you out there, establish that process, look at your SOPs, combine them, integrate them. So that's
Yeah.
really
And you asked about like doing remote audits, right? So now imagine you're going through an FDA inspection or a notified body audit, and they want to ask you, all right, tell me about your process approach. Imagine you go, oh, let our eQMS show you the picture.
right.
You want to understand, oh, how are you guys driving the discussion in management review? Oh, we have a map of that. Our system generates that map, right? And we can actually show you the actual data that moves and the packets that go through. That would be incredibly powerful.
That absolutely 100% agreed. I think we are not there yet with the auditors, but for sure this is definitely where the
With
QMS software should
I
really.
suspect that's coming, right? We just heard FDA just announced that they're going to use AI for
Yeah.
their submission reviews. How
Right.
long before you think they get, they're probably already working on a tool to help with their inspections so that
Yes.
right? So they can feed it. They say, fine, where's your repository of all your SOPs? You need to make that available to us and we're going to let our AI dig through it, right? You're not even
Totally.
going to ask questions. Their AI is going to come back and go, well, I found these disconnects. These are the things where they're not meeting the intent of the requirement, right? Here's where I can't find any records of support that they're actually doing it. It's going to head in that direction.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. No, great advice there, Steve. Great suggestions, great thoughts. Now, a final question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Given your experience for 3 decades or more than 3 decades in the industry here, what would be your top 3 suggestions for the regulated industries, companies out there to improve upon the best practices of establishing processes?
First is you have to read the entire standard or standards or regs that apply to you. You can't jump into, you can't skip the first 3 sections of 1345 and jump into section 4 because what's contained, excuse me, and especially in the first section, is all the underlying concepts like
Right.
process approach, risk-based approach, PDCA. If you haven't bothered to understand that, you're not going to understand everything in sections 4 through 8 because they're all based on that. The why exists in those first sections. And I just find that is very common, whether it's in regulated or non-regulated. If you're following 9001, nobody reads the early sections of 9001 either. The other thing they don't read is ISO 9000. which is
Yeah.
the granddaddy of all management standards. All of them. I don't care what industry you're in, which standard you're following for quality management, environmental management, safety management. The concepts are all based on 9000, right?
Right.
So if you haven't read 9000, or at least the first part of 9000, then again, you don't have the context to get it right. So you can't be a hobbyist at this stuff. And I try to tell my clients, you're going to have to know this, right? You have to be professional and understand it. That to me is the biggest piece. Advice number 2 is, take the time to do the process mapping. You can't look at each, separate activity and figure out how you're going to make the system efficient and effective. Right? I usually use the analogy, I'm a car guy, right? If I'm trying to build a car, by committee, and I haven't provided any context for how to connect stuff, and somebody goes and go, oh, I know what I want. I want a Dodge Hemi engine. And somebody else goes, well, I want the Ford transmission, right? And we're going to put drag slicks on the back on huge wheels, right? And somebody else has chosen a more lightweight axle system and gearing system. And you go to put it all together and the car falls apart, right? And it doesn't go very fast. That's what we do with quality systems, right? Everybody hyper optimizes their section because they're told, make your department as efficient and effective as possible. And they don't say, oh, but work with everybody else to do that. They just go, right? And everybody argues about who gets what money in the budget, right? And whoever screams the loudest or has the most pull gets the funding, where you could be missing the weakest part of your systems or the opportunity to interconnect, right? There's a lot of things you can reference. There used to be something called critical chain theory. There's some great books on that. And the basic, in a nutshell, is if you think of a chain and all the links, right? And the links all have different thicknesses, right? If you don't address the thinnest link, if you put all your effort into strengthening the other links, the chain doesn't get any stronger. Right? Because the weakest link got missed. And we do that all the time in planning within organizations. But again, I think that comes back to, if you don't understand the bigger picture, how do you know where to focus your attentions?
Totally. Great suggestions. Know your concepts. That's the key.
Yeah.
Read through 9000, read through sections 0 to 3 of ISO standards. Don't skip them. If you don't know the concept, you won't be able to establish a process.
Don't guess, right? They always say, don't guess, know. And that's what good leaders, right? They say they don't guess, they know. And that's great advice. The third, so I think I owe you 3 here, right? So the third piece of advice is, everybody needs to understand this. Everybody in your company participates in the quality system. And I get that a lot, going, oh yeah, we're not training sales because they're not part of the quality system. We're not training marketing or somebody, right? Or accounting. I go, no, everybody is part of your quality system. There is nobody inside that building or outside of it that is not part of the quality system. And so they all need to understand these concepts. They may not need to understand the details, but they all play a role and impact it in some way. So they better understand the basic concepts, and then hopefully the light bulbs will go on and they'll make those connections.
Absolutely. And that's why they say quality is everyone's responsibility. It's not just the quality team, but the entire organization. Great advice, Steve. This is fantastic. People who are listening in, watching us, really great advice from expert Steve here, who has served over 3 decades in the industry. This will definitely help your companies, your organizations, to be more lean, more scalable, and of course, process driven in this regulated. So Steve, thank you so much for all the great tips, all the great suggestions here. We really appreciate you joining us here, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed the discussion.